She was abandoned by her husband at her weakest moment, diagnosed with cancer, left with nothing. But what began as betrayal turned into an extraordinary story of healing, unexpected love, and a garden that brought two lives full circle. This isn't just a story about illness, it's about rebirth, redemption, and finding peace where you least expect it. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. I never imagined my life would change between a toast and the shatter of glass. That evening started like any other celebration. Soft music, the glow of candles, the clink of silver on china. Ethan, my husband, raised his wine glass across the table and smiled that camera-perfect smile he wore at business galas and fundraisers. "To 5 years of marriage," he said, "to the most beautiful woman I've ever known." I smiled, reflexively, the way I had learned to over the years, part pride, part survival. He didn't notice the delay in my response, or the way my hand trembled slightly as I lifted my own glass. My chest had been tight all week. The dull ache in my stomach had stretched into something sharper. Still, I told myself it was stress, a deadline, or maybe just a virus. That's how it starts, denial disguised as logic. But that night, my body had other plans. My glass slipped from my hand before I ever had the chance to drink. It struck the table's edge, burst into glittering fragments on the hardwood floor, and then darkness. No sound, no time. Just the rush of heat in my chest and the feeling of the room tilting sideways beneath me. When I opened my eyes, the world was a blur of motion and alarm, people gasping, chairs scraping, a man's voice, calm, firm, cutting through the chaos. "I'm a doctor," he said. That voice, I remember it more clearly than anything else that night. Dr. Daniel Hayes didn't look like a savior. He wasn't loud. He wasn't dramatic. He was still in his dinner jacket, sleeves rolled to the elbow, and had this quiet intensity in his eyes, like he was seeing more than symptoms. He crouched beside me, his hands steady as they checked my pulse, touched my wrist, pressed against the side of my neck. His fingers were warm and professional. I remember that, how clinical his touch was, yet how grounding. I was barely conscious, but I remember the way he said my name, Claire. "Claire Bennett, can you hear me?" I tried to speak, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't obey. There was something about hearing my name in his voice that felt strange, almost familiar. A woman nearby called for an ambulance. I could hear Ethan's voice, thin and panicked, saying, "She was fine just a minute ago. She just collapsed. We were celebrating our anniversary." I wanted to say something, to reassure him. But part of me knew, even then, that he wasn't really talking to me. Dr. Hayes rode with me in the ambulance. He insisted. I didn't understand why. I wasn't his patient. He wasn't even on duty. But he sat beside me, holding my wrist gently as he monitored my pulse. At one point, I remember the paramedic asking him, "You sure you want to follow this all the way?" His answer was short, final. "Yes. She might need someone who doesn't walk away." That was the first time I realized I wasn't just another case to him. At the hospital, tests were ordered. Blood work, imaging. Needles pricked, and machines hummed, and people moved around me like I was a storm no one could control. Through it all, Daniel was there. Calm, focused, watching everything. When Ethan finally arrived, I could see the strain already pulling at the corners of his mouth. His jacket was off, his shirt rumpled, his face pale. He wasn't used to this kind of unpredictability. To be fair, neither was I. Our lives had always been structured, curated, but hospitals don't care about structure. They don't care about curated lives. Hours later, Dr. Hayes stepped into the waiting room, the door hissing shut behind him. Ethan stood immediately. "Is she okay?" Daniel hesitated, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he did. "She's stable," he said. "But the initial results, they're concerning. I think we should talk privately." He didn't wait for permission. He led Ethan to one of those sterile consultation rooms, the kind decorated with framed photos of forests and beaches, like a fake attempt at serenity. I wasn't there, but I heard about it later, how Daniel delivered the blow. A possible tumor in the pancreas, liver involvement, suspicious markers. Ethan's reaction? Shock, disbelief, anger. "Cancer? At 36? No," he'd said. "There's no way. You must have misread something." Daniel was calm, firm, professional. But even he couldn't soften the facts. This wasn't caught early, and the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. By the time they brought Ethan back to my side, the smile was gone. His eyes darted around the room like he was looking for an exit. I reached for his hand. He let me hold it, but his fingers were stiff, detached, like he was already somewhere else. Some anniversary dinner, I joked weakly. He tried to smile, failed. It wasn't until Daniel returned to explain the next steps, scans, biopsies, consults, that I saw it. The flicker in his face when he said my name again, Claire Bennett, like he'd heard it before, long ago, like it meant something. Maybe I was imagining things, maybe not. But as I watched him explain the brutal logistics of fighting this, the tests, the chemo, the odds, I felt something I hadn't felt all night. Safe. Not because I understood what was happening, not because I had hope, but because here was a man who didn't look away, who didn't panic, who didn't make promises he couldn't keep. A man who, for reasons I couldn't yet understand, had chosen to stand beside a woman whose world had just begun to unravel. I had no idea then how much that choice would change both our lives. And I never would have guessed the truth waiting beneath it. A secret tied to my past, buried in a garden I barely remembered, planted in the last place I thought I'd find peace. The day after my collapse unfolded in a haze of fluorescent lights and clipped voices. I lay in a hospital bed with a view of gray clouds pressing against the window, my body aching, my thoughts fogged by medication and fear. Nurses came and went. Machines beeped and blinked. Somewhere a child cried down the hall. Ethan sat in the corner, scrolling his phone with mechanical detachment. When he wasn't tapping on the screen, he was staring into the distance with the brittle focus of someone trying hard not to be present. He hadn't spoken to me much since the night before, not out of cruelty, perhaps, but out of sheer discomfort. Crisis wasn't his element. He didn't know how to respond to something that couldn't be scheduled, pitched, or fixed with a donation. Then Dr. Hayes walked in. He didn't have a clipboard or a nurse flanking him this time. Just a quiet resolve in his eyes, the same calm I remembered from the restaurant. He nodded to Ethan, then turned to me. "Claire," he said gently, "we have some answers." The words were like a cold hand pressing against my chest. I sat up straighter, my heart hammering, even though I already knew. I had felt it the moment I hit the floor. That this wasn't something small. That this was the beginning of something irreversible. "We ran a CT scan and some advanced blood work overnight," he continued, keeping his voice low and deliberate. "There are masses on your pancreas, and your liver is showing signs of significant stress. We need a biopsy to confirm, but these signs are consistent with pancreatic cancer." The room didn't spin. It stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. Not the machines, not the beeping, not even Ethan's breath. Just the word cancer echoing in my skull like a gunshot in an empty cathedral. "No," I said, not to him, but to the universe. That can't be right. I'm 36. Daniel didn't flinch. "I know, it's rare, but it happens. And what's concerning is the progression. You mentioned you'd been tired for weeks?" I nodded numbly, and some stomach pain, but I thought it was just deadlines, stress. "That's common," he said. "Pancreatic cancer often hides until symptoms get severe. It doesn't always announce itself until it's already advanced." I looked at Ethan. His jaw was clenched, his hands white-knuckled on the armrests. He wasn't looking at me or at Daniel, just at the floor. "But there's treatment, right?" I asked, my voice a whisper. "There's surgery, chemo?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, we'll explore every option, but I want to be honest with you. Advanced pancreatic cancer has a low 5-year survival rate, around 5 to 10%. That doesn't mean you don't have a chance. It just means we have to fight this aggressively, and we have to start now." It was like being told I had weeks to pack for a journey to the moon. Nothing in my life, not the gallery openings, not the architectural contracts, not even the high-end clients I had spent a decade pleasing, had prepared me for this. This wasn't a challenge. It wasn't a setback. It was a detour off a cliff. Ethan finally spoke. "What about the costs?" he asked, not looking at me. It was a question I hadn't even thought to ask, but it hung in the room like the sharp smell of disinfectant. Daniel didn't seem surprised. "We'll have a financial counselor go over everything," he replied. "Your insurance covers a good portion of standard treatment. If you qualify for any clinical trials, those are usually covered by research sponsors. But yes, there will be costs. Travel, some medications, we'll work with you." Ethan shifted. His eyes flicked toward me, then away. I saw something in his face, something new. Not anger, not grief, calculation. Daniel noticed it too. He didn't comment, but I could feel his focus shift subtly from me to Ethan, watching him, reading the room like a seasoned poker player. Right now, Daniel said, returning his gaze to me, I want you to focus on one thing, surviving. We'll handle the details, but your job is to rest, to prepare. I nodded, though I didn't feel prepared for anything. Not even the next hour. Later that day, while Ethan stepped out to make a call or escape, Daniel returned with a nurse and a packet of papers. Consent forms. A schedule. A prep kit for the upcoming biopsy. When we were alone, I finally asked the question that had been pressing at the back of my throat since the moment I saw him again. Why are you doing this? I whispered. You're not just my doctor. You were there when I fell. You followed me here. You sit with me. Why? Daniel paused. I have my reasons, he said softly. Some professional, some personal. But this much I can tell you, Claire. I don't walk away from people who need help. Not when I know I can give it. There was something in his tone, a weight beneath his words. Like he had made that promise once before and failed to keep it, or maybe kept it too late. I didn't press. I was too tired, too raw. That night, as the IV pumped saline into my arm and the machines kept vigil by my bedside, I stared at the ceiling tiles and listened to the hospital hum. I thought about how quickly a life can break, not with a car crash or a diagnosis, but with a silence. The kind of silence that forms between two people who were once in love. Ethan came back just before midnight. He didn't bring coffee or comfort. He sat in the visitor's chair and scrolled his phone until he fell asleep with it resting on his chest. I watched him breathe, counted the rise and fall, and I wondered how long it would take before he was gone, not just emotionally but physically. I already knew it was coming. Daniel didn't come back that night. But he didn't have to. I had already begun to trust him more than I'd trusted anyone in years. I didn't know yet how deeply our lives were already connected, or how a garden I barely remembered would become the bridge between my past and my only hope for a future. All I knew then was this: I was no longer the woman I had been, the designer, the wife, the hostess, that Claire had fallen with the wine glass. What rose in her place was someone else entirely, someone who would have to learn to fight, to grieve, and somehow to hope. It happened on a Wednesday morning, exactly 11 days after my diagnosis. I woke up alone. At first, it didn't register. The bedroom was quiet, and I was groggy from the anti-nausea meds they'd sent me home with after the biopsy. I reached out instinctively, expecting to find Ethan's arm, the wrinkle of his shirt, the warmth of a body that had shared my bed for 5 years. But the other side of the mattress was cold, unwrinkled, empty. I sat up slowly, my body still sore from where the central line had been placed. The clock on the nightstand blinked 7:42. The soft light slipping through the curtains told me it was late for Ethan. Too late. He was a creature of habit, always out the door by 6:15, but his briefcase wasn't by the door. His keys weren't on the hook. His shoes weren't by the bench in the hall. Something was wrong. I called his name. Once, twice, nothing. When I stepped into the kitchen, I saw it, a single envelope on the counter, my name written in his distinct, slanted handwriting. I picked it up with shaking fingers, already knowing what it would say. Claire, I can't do this, I'm sorry. Ethan, 7 words, 7 cowardly surgical words. There was no apology, no explanation, no trace of the man who once promised to love me in sickness and in health. I stood there for a long time, clutching the letter like it might change if I held it long enough. Eventually, I sat down. And that's when I started noticing the other signs. His laptop was gone. The drawer with our passports had been left half open and empty. The wedding photo from the hallway, the one in the silver frame from Italy, was missing. At first, I thought maybe he'd just taken it with him. Then I checked our bank accounts. The browser loaded slowly, almost hesitantly, as if it already knew what I was about to see. And then, 0. Not just in our joint checking, not just the savings account we'd spent years building, but the business account too, the emergency fund. Every single one, drained, every dollar gone. The last transactions showed wire transfers, 3 in the middle of the night. Large amounts to accounts I didn't recognize. The credit cards were locked. The mortgage payment that was supposed to auto-debit the next day had been canceled. I didn't cry. Not then. I think I was too shocked to feel anything but the white-hot rush of betrayal, searing and numbing all at once. When I called Ethan's phone, it went straight to voicemail. Not full, not rejected, just unavailable. I left one message, then two, then none, because after a while, what was the point? It was nearly noon when I finally called Dr. Hayes. His voice was calm, steady, the only anchor I had left. "Claire?" he said, clearly surprised. "Are you all right?" "No," I said honestly. "Ethan's gone. He left a note. He took everything." There was silence on the line. Then a soft breath. "I'll be there in 20 minutes." True to his word, Daniel showed up on my porch 23 minutes later, dressed in jeans and a light gray sweater, his medical badge still clipped to his pocket like he'd come straight from rounds. He didn't ask permission. He didn't hesitate. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him with a gentleness that made me want to cry. He looked around, at the empty coat hooks, the untouched breakfast table, the envelope still on the counter, and something in his face changed. "I'm so sorry," he said, and I believed him. "I didn't know what else to do," I said quietly. "I haven't told anyone else yet. I can't even reach the bank manager without a police report," and I laughed bitterly. "What do I tell them? That my husband robbed me while I was sleeping? It's not even illegal. The accounts were joint." Daniel's jaw clenched, not in a performative way. Not the kind of reaction you give because you think you should. It was restrained, controlled, but angry. "You need stability," he said after a long pause. "Especially now. You're about to start treatment. You can't be dealing with eviction notices or financial tailspins while your body is fighting cancer." "I have about $2,000 in a personal account he didn't know about," I said. "That'll last a few weeks maybe. Less if the mortgage company calls." He was quiet for a beat, then looked me square in the eyes. "I have a guest house." I blinked. "What?" "It's behind my place," he said. "Separate entrance, full kitchen. It's not fancy, but it's comfortable. I've used it for visiting fellows or residents from out of state. It's empty now. You'd have privacy, and it's 10 minutes from the hospital." "Daniel," I started, but he raised a hand. "You need a place where you can rest, heal, be safe. That's all this is about." "I can't pay rent," I said. "Not yet, maybe not for a long time." "Then you won't," he replied simply. "We'll deal with that later." I sat down, overwhelmed. "This isn't normal." "No," he said, "but cancer isn't normal. Abandonment isn't normal. What happened to you is cruel. You don't deserve to face it alone." I felt my throat tighten, and that was the moment the tears came. Not the kind that you hide behind tissues and polite silence. The kind that break in waves, ugly, gasping sobs. The kind of grief that's so much bigger than pain, that's wrapped in shame, confusion, disbelief. Daniel sat quietly across from me and didn't try to stop them. He just waited. Let me unravel in peace. Later, after I'd packed 2 suitcases with the only things I still owned, he helped me carry them to his car. He opened the passenger door, adjusted the seat so I could recline, and put a bottle of water in the cup holder without saying a word. As we pulled out of the driveway, I didn't look back. I couldn't. Because if I did, I was afraid I'd still see the ghost of a woman who had once believed she was loved, standing there in the window, waiting for someone who was never coming back. Instead, I looked ahead, at the doctor driving me toward an unfamiliar home, toward the only shelter I had left, toward a truth neither of us yet understood, that the connection between us wasn't beginning now. It had started long before this, and it would change everything. The guest house was nothing like I expected. Tucked behind a quiet colonial on a shaded street in Brookline, it looked more like a cottage from a storybook than a doctor's side property. The siding was a soft dove gray. Ivy climbed one edge of the roof like it had been there for decades, and a stone path led through a small, immaculately kept garden toward the front door. I remember pausing at the threshold, my suitcase in hand, staring at the bed of lavender and Japanese ferns that bordered the porch. Something about the layout struck me, not just its beauty, but the intention behind it, the spacing of the plants. The way sunlight fell across the petals at just the right angle. It was familiar. Daniel opened the door for me and stepped aside. "It's small," he said, "but it's yours for as long as you need it." I nodded, too exhausted to say much. Inside, the space felt warm and thoughtful. A small living room with deep armchairs and a wool throw draped over the couch. A kitchenette with a French press already sitting beside a jar of ground beans, fresh linens on the bed, flowers in a simple ceramic vase by the window. "You didn't have to do all this," I said softly. He gave me a half smile. "I figured if you were going to fight for your life, you might as well do it surrounded by something beautiful." I turned to the window and caught my breath. The garden. From this angle, you could see the whole thing. A sprawling sanctuary tucked behind the main house. It wasn't just pretty, it was designed. Paths curved with purpose. Benches faced each other across flower beds that bloomed in calculated harmony. A small pond glinted in the sunlight, rimmed with river stones and flowering grasses. And then I saw it. A stone bench beneath two tall Japanese maples. The memory hit like a sudden inhale. I knew that bench. Not just the design, the placement. The exact curvature of the seat, how it angled slightly toward the rising sun. I'd drawn it, years ago, on a late night in my studio, fueled by peppermint tea and grief. I turned to Daniel, stunned. "This garden, I designed this." His face was unreadable for a second, then quietly he nodded. "I know." I stared at him. "How?" He walked slowly toward the window, his hands in his pockets. "You don't remember, do you?" "I've designed hundreds of gardens," I said, "but this one, it was special, for a woman. She was sick." "My mother," Daniel said softly. I went still. "She was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer my second year of med school," he continued, his voice low. "She didn't want a hospital bed with white walls and machines. She wanted beauty, something to hold on to, something that would outlast her." I remembered now. A referral through a mutual friend. A client who didn't want fountains or patios, just light, quiet, and color. She'd been so specific. "I want the wind to move through it. I want to smell spring even when I can't get out of bed." "She called you her garden angel," Daniel added. "Wrote about you in her journal. How you listened. How you saw her, not as a patient, but as a woman still capable of joy." I felt the room tilt around me. The scent of soil, the crinkle of old notes, the press of my pencil as I sketched the first vision of the space outside this very window. "She passed away that winter," Daniel said. "And when my father wanted to sell the house, I couldn't let it go. Not the garden, not what you gave her, so I bought it. I moved in. I've been here ever since." I sat down slowly on the edge of the armchair, my hands trembling. "All this time," I whispered, "you knew." "I didn't recognize you right away," he said. "Not until I heard your name at the restaurant. Claire Bennett. It hit me like lightning. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to overwhelm you. But when I saw you, collapsing, sick, I couldn't walk away. The silence between us was rich with something that felt almost sacred. A thread neither of us had seen, running back years, connecting grief to comfort, comfort to care. "Your mother was kind," I said finally. "She told me she wanted to create something that would live after her, something that would give someone else peace, even if she never saw it bloom." Daniel's eyes glistened. "She did. It gave me peace. And now, maybe it'll give you the same." I spent the next few days wandering the garden slowly, relearning it. The paths I'd traced, the plantings I'd argued for, the tree I'd begged the nursery to import. It was like visiting a memory in full bloom. And yet this time, I was part of it. I didn't know how long I had. The treatment hadn't started yet. My body was still recovering from the biopsy, and my mind was still catching up to the truth. My husband had left me, but this doctor, this quiet man, had been watching over me long before he ever touched my wrist in that restaurant. One afternoon I found a small stone tucked beneath a hydrangea bush near the pond, moss-covered, nearly hidden. I brushed the surface clean. Elizabeth Reed, 1960-2015. She found peace in this garden. I sat down beside it and cried for both of us, for Elizabeth, who had found her way into the earth surrounded by what she loved, and for myself, who was still fighting, still lost, but not alone. That night I knocked on Daniel's door. He looked surprised to see me standing there in slippers, wrapped in a shawl. But he stepped aside without a word. "I saw her marker," I said. "I remember her now. She told me she liked white flowers, that she wanted something rare. We planted a Franklinia. Did it survive?" He shook his head. "It died the winter after she passed. I tried to save it, but I didn't have your touch." "Franklinias are fickle," I said. "But they bloom late. They don't give up easily." He smiled. "Just like you." I don't know what happened after that moment. Not exactly. There were no declarations, no promises, just a quiet understanding that we were no longer strangers. We were bound, not just by circumstance, but by something older, deeper, by a garden that had waited years for us to meet again. There's a peculiar rhythm to chemotherapy. At first, it crashes in like a storm, cold, sudden, disorienting. You're flooded with warnings, lists of side effects, papers to sign. You brace yourself for the tidal wave, gripping the sides of your life as though the sheer act of holding on will protect you. But then it becomes a pattern, a cycle. Infusion days, recovery days, the days when the nausea creeps in before you even open your eyes, the days when your body rebels, when smells you once loved become enemies, when you forget what food is supposed to taste like. But through it all, I had the garden and Daniel. He adjusted his schedule so he could personally oversee every part of my treatment. He coordinated with the clinical trial team at Dana-Farber, kept track of my blood work, and never once made me feel like I was just another chart. There was a small table on the patio behind the guest house, shaded by one of the old maples. That became our morning ritual. Even on the worst days, when the sunlight felt too sharp and the air too heavy, I'd sit wrapped in a blanket, sipping weak tea, while Daniel brought out my lab results and updated me like I was his only patient. He never coddled me, never pretended the numbers were better than they were. But he always found a thread of hope to tug on. "Your bilirubin's down slightly," he said one morning, flipping through a folder. "That means your liver's tolerating the treatment better than we expected." "Should we throw a party?" I croaked, trying to smile. "I already brought muffins," he said, producing a paper bag with the kind of cheer that was either extremely well-practiced or heartbreakingly real. I never asked which. The garden was changing too. Summer was folding into fall, and the hydrangeas were starting to bronze at the edges. The roses, stubborn as ever, kept blooming despite the shortening days. And then one afternoon, something remarkable happened. I found the Franklinia. It was a new sapling, barely waist-high, planted exactly where the old one had once stood. Its leaves shimmered in the light like green silk, and at the tip of one delicate branch, a bud, not open yet, but ready. I turned toward the main house, where Daniel stood in the window, watching. Later that evening, I asked him about it. We were sitting at the kitchen table, the kind of quiet between us that only forms after you've weathered enough storms together. "I thought it might bring her memory back into the garden," he said. "I called the arboretum, pulled a few strings. It's from a cutting of the same line, same tree you planted years ago." I reached across the table and touched his hand, surprising both of us. "I didn't know if I'd ever see one bloom again," I whispered. "You might," he said softly. "This one's doing better than the last." I didn't ask whether he meant the tree or me. Over the weeks, something shifted between us. Quietly, respectfully. Not romance, not yet. Something softer. A deepening. The kind of connection that doesn't announce itself with fireworks, but wraps around you like warmth in the cold. There were nights I couldn't sleep from the bone-deep ache in my joints or the feverish fog in my head. On those nights, I'd turn on the porch light and find Daniel already there, coffee in one hand, research articles in the other. We spoke about everything and nothing, about his mother, her stubbornness, the way she'd hum when she cooked. About my first client, a woman who wanted a rose garden in the middle of New England winter. About what we feared, what we missed, what we still hoped for, quietly, guiltily. He never crossed a line. But every time he looked at me, I felt seen, not as a patient or a woman in decline, but as Claire. Just Claire. One morning, after a particularly brutal treatment, I woke up to find that Daniel had moved my bed closer to the French doors. The curtains were tied back, and the scent of the garden drifted in on a breeze. And there, just outside the glass, the Franklinia was blooming. White petals, delicate and bright, unfurling like a secret. I started to cry. When Daniel knocked gently and peeked inside, I couldn't speak. I just pointed to the tree. He came to stand beside me, not saying anything, just resting his hand lightly on the foot of the bed. "I thought it might bloom late," he said after a moment. "But not this late. It's perfect," I whispered. It waited. "So did I," he said. I looked up at him and for the first time allowed myself to believe in something more than survival. I didn't know what the future held. Still don't. The scans were stable, not miraculous. My body was a battlefield, still. But in that moment I felt something bloom inside me too. The strength to hope again, the strength to rebuild. Later that week, I found myself back at my sketch pad, something I hadn't touched in months. My hands still shook sometimes, and my lines weren't as clean, but the ideas were there. I started drawing again, not just for distraction, for purpose. Daniel noticed the shift in me. "You look different," he said one afternoon as we shared tea in the garden. "Worse?" I teased, adjusting my scarf. "No," he said, eyes meeting mine, alive. And for the first time in a long time, I believed him. Not just because the treatments were working, but because the woman who had once designed gardens for other people's peace had finally begun to find her own. The morning he came back was crisp and golden, the kind of autumn day that feels like it's been painted with light. I was sitting in the garden with my sketch pad balanced on my knees, trying to finalize a redesign for the corner near the pond, when Daniel's phone rang. I saw his expression change before I heard the voice on the other end. His jaw tensed slightly, his posture sharpened, and then he stood up, walked a few paces away, and said, "How did he find out where she's staying?" I froze. My pencil slipped from my fingers and landed in the grass. Daniel hung up a minute later, his face unreadable. He sat back beside me, quieter than usual. "It's Ethan," he said finally. "He showed up at the hospital looking for you. Said he wants to talk." The name landed like a stone in my chest. I hadn't spoken to my ex-husband in almost a year. Not since the 7-word letter. Not since he drained our bank accounts and vanished into whatever overseas shadows protected his pride. My first instinct was disbelief. Then came the anger. Then the cold knot of dread. "How did he find me?" I asked. Daniel shook his head. "We're not sure. It could be something as simple as a billing trail, old insurance contact, or a nurse who didn't realize the context. Either way, he's back in Boston and asking to see you." I stared at the blooming Franklinia beside the patio, the symbol of second chances, delicate, defiant. "I want to see him," I said. Daniel blinked. "Claire, you don't owe him anything." "I know," I said quietly, "but I owe it to myself, to close that door, on my terms." He didn't argue, he just nodded. "Here then. Not at the hospital, not somewhere public." "Tomorrow," I said. "Let's get it over with." Daniel's presence was constant the next morning, though he tried to make himself invisible, preparing tea, straightening up the guest house, checking the weather with meticulous focus. I could feel his tension humming just below the surface, but he never said a word to dissuade me. At exactly 2 p.m., the sound of tires on gravel signaled Ethan's arrival. I stood by the window as his sleek black European car crept into the driveway, polished to a mirror shine, an image completely out of sync with the humble sanctuary I now called home. He stepped out wearing a navy overcoat and sunglasses, more like a hedge fund executive than a man coming to apologize to his dying wife. Daniel opened the front door before Ethan could knock, their eyes locked like a silent duel. "She's waiting," Daniel said flatly, stepping aside but not moving far. Ethan's eyes flicked past him to me. "Claire," he said, removing his sunglasses, "you look well." I let that blatant lie hang in the air. I looked like a survivor, pale, thinner, wrapped in a scarf not for fashion but for warmth against the chemotherapy chills. I was not the woman he had abandoned, but I wasn't the one he remembered either. "Come in," I said, stepping back. He walked into the guest house with a confidence that would have impressed me once. Now it felt invasive. "This is cozy," he said, glancing around. "A bit rustic compared to Beacon Hill, but I suppose it works." I didn't respond. "Why are you here, Ethan?" I asked. He gave me a look, one I knew too well, the look of a man trying to play sincere. "I've made mistakes," he began. "I panicked. You were sick. I was scared, but I've had time to think, to grow. I want to make amends." I folded my arms. "And what does that look like exactly?" "A fresh start," he said. "I've been staying in Switzerland. I have a place there. Quiet, discreet, world-class medical care. You could continue your treatment there, with me. Away from this charity project." I stared at him. "Charity?" I echoed. "I just mean, Claire, come on. Living in your doctor's backyard? You deserve better. And I'm offering that. A chance to rebuild, together." I studied him, the too perfect hair, the rehearsed concern, and underneath it all, desperation. But not for me. "What's really going on, Ethan?" He hesitated, just long enough to confirm my suspicion. "I know about the federal investigation," I said, Securities fraud, tax evasion. Your partner came to see me. He felt guilty, said you'd laundered part of the company's funds through our accounts. Ethan paled, then stiffened. Jacob's a liar. He always had a thing for you. I almost laughed. So now you're here? Why? Because you think having a sick ex-wife will make you look better in court? His mask slipped then, the smile turning sharp, the voice colder. Everyone wants something, Claire, including your good doctor. Do you even know who he really is? The Reeds own half the hospital. His foundation likely paid for your treatment. You think he's helping out of kindness? You're a headline waiting to happen. Dying designer saved by heir to Boston dynasty. He's using you. I didn't flinch, because I already knew everything Ethan thought he was revealing, and more. And none of it was what mattered. You should leave, I said. You're making a mistake, he snapped. You'll regret this when the cancer comes back, when he gets bored, when you're dying and alone. I opened the door. I'm not alone, I said. He hesitated a moment, then stormed past me, his cologne lingering in the air like a bad memory. Daniel was waiting in the garden, arms crossed. They didn't speak. Ethan didn't even look back. When Daniel came inside, I was still standing by the door. You okay? He asked. I turned to him. For the first time in months, I felt light. Not happy, not healed, but free. Yes, I said. Actually, I am. We sat on the couch together, side by side, watching the wind shift through the trees. I told him everything Ethan had said, about the accusations, the lies, the threats. He listened quietly, then said, He's wrong, you know. About what? About why I've done all this. He took a breath. Claire, I didn't help you because of some foundation, or because it looked good on paper. I helped you because I couldn't not help you, because from the moment I saw you, I felt like I'd known you forever. And maybe I did, through her, through the garden, but now it's more than that. I looked at him, at the sincerity in his face. Thank you, I whispered, for staying, for believing, for not walking away. He smiled softly. You never asked for anything. That's how I knew you were worth everything. And just like that, I knew something deeper had taken root between us. Not just gratitude, not just shared history, but the slow, strong beginning of something I hadn't dared believe in for a long time. Love, not the grand, glittering kind that vanishes when the lights go out. The kind that stays when your hair falls out, when your hands tremble, when your past returns to knock down your door and someone else is already standing there to hold it closed. The kind that blooms late, like a Franklinia. 3 months later, on a cold January morning that made the windows shiver and the air feel like glass, I sat alone in the Oncology Imaging Center, waiting. Waiting had become a familiar act, like breathing, like bracing. There was a rhythm to it now. You wait for scans. You wait for results. You wait to hear if the tiny flicker of hope you've been cradling like an ember has gone out or begun to glow a little brighter. Daniel wasn't with me that morning. He had insisted on maintaining professional boundaries after the hospital's ethics committee reviewed our relationship. From that point forward, my scans and test results were managed by a team of specialists. But he was never far. We had become careful, quiet, but not distant. As I sat there, bundled in my coat and scarf, I looked around the waiting room, saw the same 2 bright chairs, the same tired eyes behind surgical masks, the same low murmur of conversations that all ended in silent prayers. I ran my fingers over the edge of the folder in my lap, a garden proposal I'd been refining for weeks. The south courtyard at Boston Memorial, the one that had long been ignored, was being cleared for construction in the spring, and I'd been asked to design a healing garden. My garden. When the nurse finally called my name, my heart skipped, not from fear, but from that fragile mixture of anticipation and dread that only cancer patients understand, the hope that blooms and withers a dozen times a day. She led me to an exam room, took my vitals, offered the usual gentle reassurances, then left me with the silence. The door opened 5 minutes later. It wasn't the assigned oncologist, it was Daniel. He held a folder in his hand, his face composed but warm, the way he always looked when he was carrying both facts and feelings. He closed the door quietly behind him and sat across from me. I thought they weren't letting you do this anymore, I said softly, surprised but relieved to see him. I'm not your primary anymore, he said, but I asked to deliver these myself. Something in his voice made me catch my breath. He placed the scans on the light board, turned on the backlight. Your pancreatic mass, he said, pointing to the ghostly image, has shrunk by 60%. The liver lesions, 72% reduction. Your tumor markers are approaching normal range, and the inflammation around the affected tissue is down by more than half. I stared at him, then at the images, then back again. What does that mean? I whispered. It means the treatment is working, he said. Better than any of us hoped. We're not saying remission, not yet. But we're no longer talking about just managing symptoms. We're talking about fighting back and winning. I didn't feel the tears right away. I felt the breath leave my body first. Then the stillness, then the trembling. He reached for my hand. The gesture wasn't professional. It wasn't even careful anymore. It was personal, immediate, deeply human. I don't know how to process this, I said finally. Start by breathing, he whispered. Then maybe start dreaming again. And that's exactly what I did. That afternoon, I walked to the hospital courtyard, snow crunching beneath my boots, cheeks flushed from the cold and the miracle still ringing in my ears. The ground had already been broken for the new garden. The cement had been pulled up, the dying shrubs removed, the space cleared like a blank canvas. I stood there imagining paths, trees, benches, places for wheelchairs to rest in the sun, spaces where families could cry or laugh or do nothing at all. A space for living, not just surviving. Daniel met me there an hour later, a thermos in hand, steam rising from the lid. Hot chocolate, he said. No judgment. I took it, still watching the garden's bones form in my mind. I want to call it Elizabeth's garden, I said. He blinked. Claire? She was the seed, I said softly. She wanted peace. You built this home around that memory. I survived because of it. It's all connected. It should carry her name. He said nothing for a long time. Then, finally, she would have loved that. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into the design, into consultations, sourcing materials, sketching through the night when I couldn't sleep. The energy came back slowly, then in bursts, like a body waking up from a long winter. My hair began to grow again, soft, dark tufts that I ran my fingers through like they were wildflowers in spring. My appetite returned. My laugh too, though it still caught me by surprise. One evening, Daniel brought me a framed letter, a copy of something his mother had written in her final months, one I'd never seen. It read, "The woman who came to build me a garden brought more than flowers. She brought light. If she ever finds herself in the dark, I hope she remembers the path she carved here. It's not just for me, it's for her too." I didn't cry when I read it. I smiled, a deep, aching smile, because somewhere along the way I had started carving my own path again. Not just in the soil, but in the life I thought I'd lost. Daniel and I had grown careful, respectful. But one night, under the stars, beside the newly planted Franklinia, he took my hand in his and said, "You saved my mother's heart, and you've healed mine." "I didn't do anything," I said. He shook his head. "You came back. That's everything." We kissed then, not with urgency or fear or passion stoked by desperation, but with gratitude, with joy, with wonder. The kind of kiss that says we're here. Still here. In February, we broke ground officially on the garden. By spring, it had a name, a plaque, and a waiting list of patients asking when it would open. By summer, it would be full of life. And me, I was full of plans. For gardens, for walks, for one more morning curled in a blanket with hot tea and someone who had chosen to stay. Not because I was dying, but because somehow, against all odds, I was finally, gloriously, living. Spring arrived with the quiet insistence of a promise kept. The garden bloomed in bursts, daffodils first, then hyacinths, then the pale blush of cherry blossoms nodding along the path like old friends returning from a long absence. Every morning, I walked through the space that was once a concrete courtyard and now was something far more sacred. A place reborn. A space meant for healing, not just of bodies, but of broken spirits. The Elizabeth Reed Healing Garden was dedicated on a mild June morning, a year, almost to the day, since I had collapsed in that candlelit restaurant. I stood beneath the same maples I had once sketched in an apartment filled with books I had since sold, wearing a soft linen dress and a smile I wasn't faking. Nathan stood beside me, tall and quiet in his charcoal suit. The sun caught the silver at his temples. His hand hovered near mine. Not possessive, just present, always present. A crowd had gathered, Patients in wheelchairs, nurses on break, administrators, friends, donors, and volunteers. The local paper had sent a photographer. The hospital board was there. And so was Shannon, my sister, who had flown in from Oregon after 2 years of distance, of silence. Neither of us had been ready to break until now. She hugged me like we'd never been apart. "You look amazing," she whispered, blinking back tears. "I feel alive," I replied. The chairman of the board, a distinguished man with a voice like warm cedar, stepped up to the microphone. "Today, we dedicate this garden not just to the memory of Elizabeth Reed, whose vision inspired this sanctuary, but to the courage and artistry of Claire Bennett, whose own journey through illness has left all of us humbled and profoundly moved." Applause rose like wind through trees. I felt it move through me, but didn't let it carry me away. I was still tethered to the soil beneath my feet, to the people around me, to the life I was building again, one rooted breath at a time. I cut the ribbon with silver scissors and stepped forward as the garden opened. As people wandered the winding paths, touching petals and stone, I saw something I hadn't dared hope for a year ago. Peace on their faces. Real peace. Later that day, Nathan and I walked through the garden alone, stopping beside the Franklinia, now nearly my height. It had bloomed early this year. A defiant riot of white flowers like little flags of victory. I traced my fingers gently along the edge of a petal. "She would have loved this," Nathan said softly. "She's here," I replied. "Everywhere. In the shade, in the light, in the way this space makes people slow down and breathe again." We sat on the bench, the one I had designed for reflection, and watched as a young mother pushed a stroller past the koi pond. A nurse guided an elderly man to a quiet alcove with tulips. 2 teenagers sat cross-legged under the arbor, heads bent together, whispering. Life. Life everywhere. "I have something for you," Nathan said after a moment, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. My heart stumbled. He opened it slowly. Inside was a simple gold ring, elegant, unflashy, a small garden of engraving wrapped around the band. A tiny Franklinia flower, barely visible unless you were looking closely. "I know we've already crossed lines," he said gently, "but this one, I want to cross with you beside me, not as your doctor, not even as the man who waited outside while you fought for your life, but as the person who fell in love with your strength, with your fire, with the way you never gave up on beauty, even when the world around you turned ugly." I stared at the ring, then at him. "I'm not a sure thing, Nathan," I said. "There's still risk, still follow-ups, still shadows I don't always talk about." He took my hand. "There's risk in everything worth holding," he said. "But I'd rather face every uncertain day with you than live a lifetime of guarantees without you." My eyes burned, but my voice didn't tremble. "Yes," I said. "Not just for the now, but for whatever's next." We didn't have a traditional wedding. We didn't need one. We married in the garden that fall, under the amber canopy of trees we both loved, surrounded by the people who had carried us through. Shannon walked me down the path. Daniel's father, Richard, gave a short, surprisingly emotional blessing. And when we kissed, the Franklinia dropped a single bloom at our feet. A sign, if you believed in that sort of thing. I did. The hospital gave me a small office near the oncology wing, where I began designing private garden retreats for long-term patients. We called the program Places of Peace, and within a year, we built 3 more. I taught part-time at the local design college, started a support group for women rebuilding their careers after major illness, laughed harder than I had in years, loved deeper than I thought possible, and I wrote, not about cancer, not about loss, but about roots, renewal, the landscapes we carry inside us that no diagnosis can touch. One January morning, 2 years since that restaurant, 1 year since my prognosis had stabilized, I stood in the frost-lined garden with a thermos in hand, watching as the first crocuses cracked the earth. Nathan came out beside me, sliding his arm around my waist. "Looks like spring's coming early," he said. "No," I replied, leaning into him. "It's right on time." And somewhere in the quiet, in the air still tinged with winter, I understood that this garden, this man, this second breath at life, wasn't just survival. It was resurrection. The garden had been a gift I gave to someone else once. It had come back to me in full bloom. So had I. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of Claire and Nathan's story. Your time here means more than words can express. This story reminds us that life isn't just about surviving. It's about choosing to keep growing, even when everything feels broken. It's about the strength that blooms in silence, the love that arrives when least expected, and the power of second chances to heal wounds we thought were permanent. Sometimes, the very thing that nearly destroys us becomes the soil from which something more beautiful can grow. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you reflect, we'd love to know. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Your voice matters in this community we're building together. And if you'd like to hear more stories of hope, healing, and the quiet resilience of the human spirit, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We have many more powerful journeys coming your way. Some heartwarming, some heartbreaking, all unforgettable. Let's keep walking through these stories together.